And we have a kind of two discussants who have prepared comments in those angles. And so first, I would like to invite Professor Pavel Funat, who is a Vice Dean for Study Affairs, Faculty International Relations. And there will be two comments from the panelists, and then we will follow the discussions among themselves. So basically, Professor Pavel Funat and also Professor Yong Soy, who prepared comments in the field of financial sectors, will present their views, and then discussion will follow. So that's the format. And then second one is education and labor market issues. That's the second broad issue. And the last one is governance and policy-making process. So those three, we are going to conduct discussions covering three broad agenda. So could Professor Pavel Funat, we prefer you presenting while sitting because that will economize time. So I think that your slides will be displayed by assistant. Okay. So let me just introduce again Professor Pavel Funat, who is a Vice Dean for Study Affairs, Faculty of International Relations, and he is from University of Economics in Prague. So welcome to talk.
Thank you very much. So I'll have a very short presentation. Yeah, you can see it now, which is on global and European imbalances, and I will, during this presentation, I will comment what was already said, because I've seen many points that simply connect my presentation with especially the three ones. Yeah. That's why so I'm first, as I understood, but maybe I will also tackle some political issues, because I also deeply agree with the fact that this is not only economic or financial crisis, this is also a political crisis, as Professor Ogard said earlier. So if I can have the first slide with a chart showing the global imbalances, and may I have the next slide, please? Oh, thank you. So global imbalances are usually defined as differences that are seen on current accounts of globally systemically important countries. As you know, we have some countries running large and excessively large current account surpluses, such as China, Germany, also Japan. And on the other hand, we have countries that are running excessively large current account deficits. First and most important deficit is the one of the United States, but there are other countries, especially the southern tier of the European Union, some emerging countries of Eastern Europe that are also extensively running current account deficit, which doesn't have to be wrong. I think that professors of finance could say that this even shows us that the world is working, that savings and investment are reallocated to the investment channels. But IMF and OECD and other important organizations define global imbalances as imbalances that are excessive, that not only show that the financial system is working, but they also show the weaknesses. And the weaknesses that were especially stressed by Professor Foucault in his speech, because he has shown us all the reforms that are needed in Japanese labor markets and others. These are those that are most often mentioned when it comes to why Japanese surplus is so persistent. There are same kinds of reforms that China should introduce, and many other countries. Also for the European Union, if you think about the surplus countries such as Germany, it's usually mentioned that for them the labor market reform would be especially vital. So if you understand, can I have the next slide, please? Here we can see how the global imbalances developed during the current crisis, and this is how I would comment on Professor Oltun's presentation, because I strongly agree with him that for Europe, it was euro that created part of the problem. But because we can see the very same development globally, it cannot be just euro. So from this point of view, I would add that besides euro, it was also the loose monetary condition globally. It's difficult to explain whether it was the global savings glut, as Bernanke said, or whether the things were more complicated than that. I rather think that they were more complicated. These are global things that simply contributed, and in Europe, to the loose conditions introduced by euro. So we really must seek for the deep things that must be reformed in not only European but also other global countries to find the answer what started this current crisis. And as I said, if it was the loose monetary condition and we now try to cope with the crisis with even more loose monetary condition, something might be bad in the solution we are currently introducing. If I can have the next slide. It just says the main problems of the most important countries, shows the list. I've already mentioned most of the issues. So I will turn to another important thing. If we are having some reaction to the current crisis, and part of it is the loose monetary conditions, I would stress that there's the most important thing, and that's the reform part, especially structural reforms, reforms of financial systems, because from this very brief presentation you can see that there are countries coping with the very same set of problems that can only be answered by very decisive reforms done by decisive government, which can be the problem of the political decision making of these days. If I can have the next slide, it will lead us to Europe, because I wanted to conclude with the situation of the European Union, which is especially hard. As you can see, the picture of the European current accounts is quite similar to the one that we could have seen globally before the current crisis. This is usually referred to as European imbalances. We have countries with excessive current account surpluses, most notably Germany, but also Austria, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Finland, countries that we would probably call the hard core of the European integration process, maybe the countries that deserve euro, or even better, countries that can live with euro without major problems. And then we have current account deficit countries, Spain, Ireland, Greece, Portugal, but also France, which can be a huge problem for any decision-making or resolution of the European problem, France being on the other side of the barrier, if I can say it that way. On the next slide, there are the problems that are sources of the European imbalances, and they are mostly the competitiveness problems. There are problems of structure, problems in thousand-tier countries, and these must be faced by reforms. We have seen some numbers about Germany did its part in labor market reform, but I would say too little and maybe too late. So there is much more needed to be done in the future for Europe to overcome the thing. And it's really, in my eyes, driven by competitiveness, not that much by government, but by structure of businesses, by environment for investment, by the conditions that governments contribute to, but not entirely to governments. So my final comment would be to the third pillar of our reaction, the fiscal stimulus. I would be rather careful, because we have already stimulated our economies too much and we are too much indebted. I would rather stress the third pillar, the structural reform, not only in Japan, but also in Europe, as you can see from these brief comments. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. So the next panelist is Professor Yon Soy, who is a professor and director of EU Center Graduate School of International Studies of Seoul National University. So welcome.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Well, since I was not assigned to a specific paper, I just read the titles of all the papers, and one of them is somewhat familiar to me, so I just chose the my ESS paper to provide comment on. But that does not mean I will not provide very detailed comments on his the presentation. But basically, I mostly agreed with what he argued, but I want to further emphasize his main arguments by focusing on the experience of Asian countries. He mentioned the finance was a source of problem, but not is a part of solution, and he emphasized we should limit contagion of financial crisis, and also he emphasized the exceeding quantitative easing may cause a problem in the global economy. Next page. And next. Well, basically, the finance has many roles in the economic development, and here this page summarizes various roles of finance in economic growth. And the group says that it has a positive role, and another negative role, and a third maybe there is no relation between economic development and finance. But okay, next page. If we look at the experience of East Asian emerging countries, maybe Japan may not be included, but if we look at the experience of other emerging East Asian countries, then we can find that the finance may have a somewhat negative role in economic development or in sustaining of the economic development. I'm going to show two figures. Okay, the next page. Yeah, this figure shows what happened in Korea during the Asian crisis around 1997 and 1998. Well, just to look at the change of the red bar. And before the Asian crisis, there was a huge capital inflow, but all of a sudden, the direction of capital flow changed to the negative $11.5 billion. So net change was around $22 billion. Even though the Korean economy was in sound condition, that was too much. Okay, next page. But the same thing happened around during the global financial crisis. Again, just to look at the red bar. So just before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, there was huge capital inflow. The amount was the $64 billion, but all of a sudden, it again changed the direction to -1, and the amount was $53 billion. So the net change was the $116 billion. Just to compare that amount of the capital movement and the size of the Korean economy, then you can easily find even though the economy was in good shape, it could not stand for that kind of huge change of capital flow. So from those two figures, what I want to emphasize is to prevent that kind of financial crisis from happening again, we should reduce the exposure to external shocks. But to reduce okay, next page. To reduce the exposure to external shocks, one key the key role is just to reduce the volatility of international capital flow. So usually we can take two policy responses. One is just put levy on those the capital transaction. One example is Tobin's tax. Another example is just bank levy on the non-core liabilities. But there is another policy response, which is kind of regional monetary and financial cooperation. So for example, if the East Asian countries cooperate with each other and develop financial markets, then Asian money, which is the main source of the world financial market, so Asian money could be circulated in Asian region, then we may reduce our exposure to external shocks originating from the US or European countries. And so what I'd like to suggest here, for the first, the policy suggestion, maybe the East Asian countries and Asia Pacific and European countries can cooperate each other. But for the second solution, maybe the Asia Pacific countries or East Asian countries can cooperate each other. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So any kind of additional comments or questions in this field, I mean, among panelists, but perhaps would Professor David Nates, would you like to respond to some of the issues raised?
Is that any better? Those are both very interesting contributions. I thought the conclusions of what we've just heard are ones which are very widely shared in Asia. Mm-hmm. I went to the central bank governors meeting in Kuala Lumpur last week, And a large part of their discussion was looking at two sorts of responses. One is just simply to be able to slow down what the financial sector can do, and that's where a Tobin tax will go.
Yeah.
But the trouble with a Tobin tax is everybody has to do it. Otherwise, all you do is you push the flows somewhere else, and somebody else is getting all the employment and the profits from the transactions. The other issue, of course, is that it depends how financial markets are developing in those countries. And there's enormous variation across the Asian countries. You can't treat them as if they're all of one type. Those who are developing pension funds and capital markets, they're beginning to get some greater cushion, which enables them to look rather further. I mean, one of the ironies is that derivatives are actually helpful. That you may feel that with the derivative experience in the United States before the global financial crisis, that they're not a helpful mechanism. But those extremes are unusual. The large range of normal range of derivatives enables you to manage your risk a great deal better and to be able to absorb the external shocks. The other half of the conversation was the first part of those remarks on that last slide, which is looking at trying to reduce vulnerability. And one of the particular ones is trying to get a better match between the currencies in which you deal. But one of the things which has been very clear is that the use of swaps is something which works a lot better actually for the similar size effort compared to just having reserves. That in practice reserves seem to have a limited ability. But I think the last thing I should point out is that quite a large number of the instruments which are being reintroduced and resuggested now are ones which have caused problems in the past. The instruments which are the most effective are the ones which cause the greatest distortions in economies, and therefore there's a dilemma. You can either use things which are not very effective and not very distortionary, or things which are effective and are distortionary, and that's not really very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please.
I would also add a short comment to the idea of more close financial integration or financial cooperation in Asia, because we have it in Europe and it still didn't work. And it's really about what Professor Mayer said. In Europe, there should have been a balance of payments crisis when there was a sudden stop of inflows to Spain, Greece, and other countries, but it never happened because the target system within the European Central Bank and the European Monetary Union simply changed the flows of capital. Instead of private capital, there is now a public capital flowing to the southern tier. And the important thing is, even though it creates some stability, it enacted economic mechanisms that would normally create tension for the southern tier countries to reform more quickly. I mean, the economic theory knows the automatic stabilizers of the current account and distortions in balance of payments, but we have made them inactive by our political decisions. So this is the threat I see, that more political involvement we do, we simply distort the economy. And here in the situation of the balance of payments and the mechanisms that are known for centuries, we really see that it works, that the political decision-making creates some stability, some comfort, but it also makes it possible not to reform. And that's a bad thing, I'd say.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good point. And any other comments or questions in this field? I just have just one question to Professor Mates. You mentioned that one role for the financial system to enhance the role of, the policy should be designed to enhance the role of financial sector for growth. But I think much of your slides focus on how to avoid financial sector not disrupting the real economy. And but could you kind of elaborate what role could financial sector might play more actively for kind of growth process?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that everybody has been really keen on stability. By stability, they don't mean obviously that nothing changes, but that you have smooth growth paths and everything moves upwards steadily towards the top right-hand corner of the graph. My view about the financial sector is that that's not going to happen. What the financial sector will do is to absorb the shocks in the real sector. So you can get a smoother real sector, but at the expense of a more fluctuating financial sector. What you don't want is, as I said at the beginning, which is that the fluctuations in the financial sector then cause fluctuations in the real sector, but it's the other way around. And so one of the things which is ironic about the process of growth is that naturally you get failures of some sort. Not everybody succeeds. And if you've got a strong growth path, you've also got a strong path of failures. And your problem is to absorb those failures without disrupting the entire economy. What we're now trying to work out around the globe is how to have failures in the financial sector without it being a disaster for everybody. And I think we're now getting closer to that. So it's helping the reorganization there. We're going to get losses in any period of development. Some people succeed, some people lose. And you've got to be able to absorb those. But I think in what one of the other slides we've got in the presentation is one of the issues which we're very clear about now is the issue of fairness and the way in which some of the processes have been going in the past have not been particularly fair in two respects. One is income distribution, but the other is employment distribution. And that we're there, these are real issues, and that we're far more focused on those and getting the financial sector to help us with those rather than to make them worse.
Okay, thank you very much. So let us move to the second issue, second project agenda. That is education and labor market issues. And Professor Lina Coelho prepared comments in that field. So I'd like to invite Professor Lina Coelho. She is a professor and vice dean of Faculty of Economics, University of Coimbra of Portugal.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, in fact, my comments focus on what I would call the most strategic factors that may sustain real sector recovery at medium and long term. As we have all concluded today, we want a more stable and trustful and balanced financial international system. We want also to cope with technological and scientific changement. And most of us want also a green economy and solving climate challenges. And we also would like to have more inclusive societies. And what these all have in common is that they will be attained only in an international cooperation basis. Any one of these goals won't be realized if we don't work all together in a worldwide basis. Well, in fact, my comment focused more in the particular situation of Portugal, which, as has been said today, lives a very hard crisis in the moment. Can you pass, please, change the slide? Okay, so we are facing a program of financial assistance, and so we have at a short time all that question of pursuing fiscal consolidation, deleveraging, and financial stability in the short term. But in the medium and long term, the success of the Portuguese economy, as the success of the Japanese economy, as we heard here today, would pass through creating new market opportunities for technological innovations. And this will, in many cases, as we also heard this morning with the example of that company that was presented to us, that wouldn't be successful if it doesn't happen in a global market basis. And so, can you change the slide, please? And so in the Portugal case, we have been investing strongly in human resources. And now we have now a high-skilled and motivated younger workforce, which has with competitive wages, even because the wages have been decreasing because of the crisis. And so we have this asset, which is a very important asset for the future. And we heard about the importance of speaking and learning English. Well, Portuguese people have a particular competence in learning foreign languages. And we now have something like 42% of the population speaking fluently English, which is particularly important. Please, can you change? Well, and I would like to give you what I may call a good example. We have begun what is called the MIT Portugal Program, which involve MIT, government, academy, and industry in Portugal, so MIT in the United States, of course. And it represents a commitment, a strategic commitment to strengthen the country's knowledge base through an investment in human capital and institution building. We have heard also here about the importance of building institutions appropriate to the change. This program in particular has targeted bioengineering systems, engineering design and advanced manufacturing, sustainable energy systems and transportation, which are areas that we have been developing. Our young engineers have been studying and applying in new startups this knowledge. And so the MIT program is targeted to reinforce these human capital. This would be my short contribution. Maybe we can do something like the MIT program in the social fields with the institutions, the university institutions that are present here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think that education or improving competitiveness in the labor market is a very important critical issue in both Japan and Europe. And any questions or comment in this field? Yes, please.
No, I agree completely, but just two points. The MIT Portugal collaboration is splendid, but on education, we shall focus on utero, on preschool years. Those are the most important years for education. If you want to build human capital, start with the social conditions of the mother. That will determine the social and skills, and they're very, very important. The university is also important, but from a comparative perspective, from an equality of opportunity view, the public financing of education, I think that shall focus on these years. I think that we agree. And the second one, I won't be that optimistic about where applied research is located. From a normative point of view, I agree that it's good to have collaborations. But how a company doing development or doing applied research decides where to locate that research with the same criteria that decide where to put a logistics plan, cost and benefits. Which is the largest employer in Cambridge, Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm.
No Harvard, no MIT, Novartis. Novartis has 12 buildings.
Ah.
Why has gone Novartis there? To cooperate with the States? No. It has gone there because it's where the price of the researcher and the environment is more convenient. So I agree from a normative point of view, but we should also consider the positive decisions in the world that is price and quality.
Any other comments or questions?
I
Yes,
would
please.
only
Yes.
answer that, in fact, that is true. But when we work on that, we must precisely be aware of that cost and the opportunity costs and the price of investing in technology and science. And so we must build markets also. So it's not enough to educate, to form new engineers. We must build the markets and be aware of the conditions in which they are built to take profit of the education process. Thank you.
Any comments? I mean, I'm not an expert on European economy, but I think I see that kind of relatively high unemployment rate among youth, I mean, among young people. And I think that in the case of Japan and the United States, although part-time workers' share are increasing, but unemployment of young people are very small. And I think that's maybe a very distinct difference between European labor market and but I think in the case of Germany, they have very stratified training program, and so therefore I think that relatively speaking, unemployment of young people are limited. But do you have kind of any analysis of that issue and how we can address?
Well, if I can, well, as a matter of fact, I think that the main reason why we in Europe, and especially in the south countries of Europe, have that huge rate of unemployment is that because we built employment markets who are very dual. And so we have many rights to older workers which have long-term contracts, and then very few protection for younger workers. And so what does this mean? This means that older workers have stable employment, and they rob the jobs for younger, and in a very unproductive way, an inefficient way. And so there is a need, which is being done effectively, of huge reforms in the employment markets, and that are being done in Portugal, in Spain, everywhere, I think.
Thank you very much. Any comments or questions? Any comments from Professor Fukao on the labor market issues?
Yeah, so again, we don't have serious unemployment issue even in younger generation. But again, I think the part-time worker problem causes, in the long run viewpoint, causes huge loss from the viewpoint of accumulation of human capital. In the case of Japan.
So thank you very much. So let us move to the third big issue, that is governance and the policy making process. And I think this is a very important issue. And we have two panelists who prepared comments from that angle. And first, I would like to invite Professor Dr. David Embal, who is a research fellow, International Political and Strategic Studies of the Australian National University. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Hitotsubashi University in the EU SI for hosting this very interesting and productive symposium. Having listened to some of these excellent presentations this morning and also in this afternoon session, I'm very much aware of my own limited knowledge in terms of economic policy in the Asia Pacific. Therefore, what I thought that I might offer to the symposium is to provide a security studies perspective on some of the linkages between regional economics and regional security in the Asia Pacific, and perhaps also provide a view on how Australia is attempting to manage or deal with some of these economics / security challenges that are present in the region. And we have here a very yellow-green image of our new Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, attempting to not always successfully engage in the region. Now, two approaches to understanding security dimensions of economics in the region from the liberal and realist schools of international relations, and they view the relationship or the causal effects of security and economics quite differently, and particularly in terms of how they see changing economics, whether that be in terms of economic growth or economic decline, shaping security relationships. Liberals, on the one hand, view growing economies or changing economies and different trading relationships as reducing the likelihood of conflict, since these changes raise the opportunity costs of this potential conflict. By contrast, realists who are by nature perhaps overly pessimistic have in the past tended to view economics and trade as a component of national power, and accordingly they view states' security interests as overriding commercial interests. And they see changing economics, changing trade relationships, therefore as a potential or likely cause of conflict. So I think these two viewpoints have obvious relevance as explanations or attempts at explanations of the linkages between economics and security in the Asia-Pacific region. In particular, the rise of China economically and in terms of security in the region, and basically the economic change this rise is bringing to the region in terms of shifting the balances of power in the region, an important part of understanding these linkages. One of the questions that we have in international relations then is, will these changes, or are these changes likely to support liberal or realist arguments in terms of the economic security linkages? Now, one of the challenges for the Asia-Pacific, as scholars such as John Ravenhill have noted, concerns the process of securitisation. And this basically refers to situations where political actors begin to recognise particular issues as posing a threat to national security. So they see what are hard power security issues becoming security concerns. And whether or not certain issues become securitised, therefore, depends on arguably mutual perceptions and misperceptions of states, certainly in the view of realists. And indeed, realists argue that there is always a tendency for states to see issues as security threats, since states operate basically in an anarchical international system where security provision is basically on a self-help basis. So states are prone to perceive even non-hard power security issues sometimes in security terms. So an issue for the Asia-Pacific then is how these kind of fears compete against the rational cost-benefit analysis that I've just mentioned. what might be these issues for securitization in the Asia Pacific. And we can see that issues of economic development or economic change and hard power appear, and the linkages between these two appear in a number of different instances. For example, we could look at the conflict or dispute over rare earth metals between China and Japan in 2010 as providing one case study for securitization. So by imposing export restrictions on its rare earth metals in response to a territorial dispute with Japan, China in effect was linking economics with a traditional foreign policy issue, in part because it perceived locking up raw materials as an issue of national interest, as a state security concern, and also as a useful diplomatic tool. Of course, China's greater role in the region that I mentioned changes the impact of these kind of decisions in terms of securitization of economic issues, their impact on the regional economy. So finally, in terms of Australia, how is Australia dealing with these kind of changes, with the securitization of economic issues, for instance, in the region? Australia, for the first time in its history, in fact, faces a strategic environment in the Asia Pacific where its main security guarantor may no longer also be its main economic partner. Traditionally, at least since the Second World War, both of these roles have been played by the United States. But the changing nature of power in the region is now meaning that these roles are separating. And Australia, as a result, is debating some of the implications of this separation. It's, for instance, focused clearly on policy questions of how Australia should manage or balance these difficulties. And it's also beginning to debate what kind of implications might come from contest over primacy in the region, in particular between the United States and China. In some ways, Australia's situation is similar to Japan's in terms of having to balance different kinds of partners, economic and strategic. However, the Australian context in some ways lacks the same scope for securitization when compared to the Japanese situation. Australia, for instance, is largely a supplier of raw materials and has no direct involvement in some of the traditional security disputes in the region, whether that be over Taiwan or over the South China Sea or potentially over the East China Sea. Instead, Australian angst is more generalised and focuses on overall regional relations, the need to protect trade routes as a maritime trading country, and in some ways having to avoid making the strategic choice between economic partner and strategic partner. The rising concern, therefore, for Australia is arguably one of entrapment in external issues that become securitised. So whether these be disputes over rare earths or trade disputes between different countries in the region that may cause schisms, for example, in ASEAN, or greater rivalries in Northeast Asia, Australia is very much worried about entrapment and these kind of disputes leading to unpalatable strategic choices. The Australian response so far has been somewhat mixed. It is certainly focusing more clearly on the region, and thus the new Prime Minister visited Indonesia as his first point of call. It's focused also on developing free trade arrangements in the region and also wider arrangements including the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yet there are complications to many of these policies. Australia's approach to direct foreign investment, for instance, provides a good illustration of how the securitisation of economic issues, particularly in the mining and agricultural sectors, can cause confusing foreign policy. The previous Australian government's decision, for instance, to ban the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei from involvement in the country's new national broadband network is another potential minefield of securitisation. So to conclude then, I think for those interested in the linkages between economics and security in the Asia Pacific, there is a need to better understand this securitization process and what some of the paths of cause and effect might be. I think this is important academically, but I think it also has clear policy making implications for those trying to avoid the spread of traditional security disputes into non-traditional areas in terms of economics or other disputed areas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next panelist is Dr. Brendan Smith, who is the head of London School of Economics China External Relations Division and associate. So, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I wish to do in my 5 to 10 minutes is sort of bring together what has been discussed over the morning session and the early afternoon session on this issue of revitalization in Asia and Europe. And my essential conclusion is that it's very much in the balance. If we move to the next slide, looking at Europe, I had proposed to go through some of the particularly protracted problems, but my colleagues have already done so over their lectures. Professor Ertan went into some detail on the euro crisis and how we got to the euro crisis, or as I like to say it, how Germany led us to the euro crisis, and certainly to the southern European nations. Professor Mayos, I think, highlighted that in Europe there is very little room for maneuver now. And Europe probably realistically is one shock away from a deflationary cycle. The Eurostat index from last week on the inflation rate, a harmonized inflation rate in the European Union, it was at 0.9%, the lowest since the Lehman crisis. And of course, for the indebted countries, this makes it particularly difficult when you're Italy, and by 2015, 2016, you're going to have a 149% debt ratio with your GDP. And how do you get out of this this cycle? So that was referred to some extent by Professor Mayes. Professor Morton, I think, very wisely also mentioned on the leadership issue in Europe and a leadership crisis to some extent. Europe and the EU has been driven traditionally by the Franco-German axis. This has been the motor or the engine. Germany controls the economics, the French the politics. And with the economics, it's even more the case with Germany. And on the political front, the French and President Holland is willing, but the French are not capable. And at the same time, when you look at the other major player within the EU, the UK is capable but not willing. And you have the debate within the UK on less of Europe, while on the European continent you have the debate of more on Europe. So this, as you correctly say, makes for a leadership vacuum, and then leaves Angela Merkel able to drive things forward in a fashion that suits Germany, and it suits German banks and German industry. So that, to some extent, and I've also Professor Jean-Marie, I think also, took it to a human level, which is very important when you talk about austerity and what's happening in the countries around Europe, and the attitudes of young people and their perspective on what they believe are their opportunities for the future. And I know it only looked at France and the UK and other countries, and the level of pessimism. And when you're talking about revitalization, you're talking about individuals that are willing to take the risks in business to do something new and innovative to push growth forward. I mean, that ultimately is what it comes down to when you talk about revitalization. So all of that's very negative. But on Europe, Europe in the past has been in a similar hole. In the early 1980s, in the mid-1980s, there was a lot of Euroscepticism. You had Eurosclerosis. You had little growth. You had a Europe that was way behind on competitiveness with the United States. And you had a European economic community that was able to turn itself around, primarily led by a Frenchman through Jacques Delors and the European Commission, and that was able to innovate on the single market in 1986, which was an innovation that led us to the European Monetary Union. So maybe he did too much in that sense. But I think one, from the outside looking at Europe, one can be very negative with the European Union. And I mentioned this at the bottom here. The EU is all about muddling through, or about incremental change, and at times looks very disjointed, both at the European level and at the national level. But nonetheless, it moves forward to solutions. But in this case, the solution, or the conundrum, I say, is how you bring about growth to all the European Union. And there's going to be some painful requirements for the EU. I think they will take them, they'll have to take them on, certainly when you look at debt in Italy, you'll have to look at a write-down there, or extending the period of payment, or discounting the coupon, or whatever. So that'll be the one major economy within the Eurozone. Spain should be fine, and Greece, Ireland are small, Portugal, peripheral economies. So I would still be optimistic on Europe, on its ability to get over these problems through the machinery that you mentioned, both Professor Mayers on the financial services, and then at the same time in restructuring what you talked about, Pavel, on restructuring various economies at the national level, and then using European tools to reinforce this. So I would end on Europe on a positive note. If you can go to my next slide. When you talk about revitalization in Asia, or indeed globally, you have to consider China. And China is also retooling its economy, because it has to if it wants to go to the next level. If it wants to move beyond being the world's factory and producing and exporting, which leaves it very exposed to downturns, as we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years in Europe and the US, which it was able to weather very well because it is a huge fiscal stimulus of 4 trillion Chinese yuan, which worked fairly well through state-owned enterprises, and they can build more roads, more airports, more high-speed railways, which are generally required. But this is not long-term sustainable. So when we talk about sustainable revitalization globally, we have to be concerned about what the stability of the Chinese economy and their ability to retool. Is that possible? You know, I've been 13 years in China. The longer I spend in China, I don't become clearer, I just become more confused. So from one level of confusion to a higher, which is quite normal, because you were talking about a very opaque model of economics, where I say there's multiple economies in a socialist market framework, whatever that means. And you're also dealing with situations and problems which could be have immediate impact. Over the last couple of months in the summer, you know, there's a lot of talk about China's public debt to GDP ratio. You know, officially it's at 34-35%, but some research and some analysts in China would have it as high as 200% of GDP, if you include the SOEs and the local governments, which you have to. So you have that concern there as well, and then you have this drive by the Chinese government to move China towards what will be described as a consumption economy. In other words, they are buying more stuff from the rest of the world, from Japan and Europe and elsewhere, which they have been doing, which has been keeping Germany afloat on high-end technology, and indeed Japan as well has been very important, contributed to that. But how do the Chinese take that to the next level? I mentioned here some of the social factors are actually powerful drivers for this economic change and continued growth in China. Because what you're seeing is a Chinese population and a rising middle class, and the Communist Party is determined to increase the size of the middle class. That is a stated goal, the wish to have a larger middle class. And in turn, that puts the pressure on them to be able to deliver services and, of a sufficiently high level or expectation to their population that in turn requires them to cooperate with other countries in bringing in these services, whether it's high-end technology or whether it's in education, whether it's in the health system, or in looking at social welfare models and a genuine national pension system and social safety net. And indeed, I could also add there on environmental issues. You know, Beijing at the moment is experimenting with a Danish design on a hoover that can suck in the pollution within small confined areas within the city and therefore reduce to some extent the pollution within the cities. So these are technologies that the Chinese may not have or that they wish to cooperate internationally with because they're under pressure continuously from their citizens to improve their quality of life. So I see that as something that's positive. At the same time, you have a larger middle class with rising expectations. And you know, Professor Jean-Marie's survey, when you looked at the Chinese expectations and attitudes, very positive on what their life was going to be like, very positive on what their country's future was going to be like. So these are massive expectations for the party to try and deliver on. Can they deliver with the new leadership? It's much too early to say. In China, you know, you had the change in party leadership last October. You had a change in government leadership. They are technically separate in March this year. And it's too early. They haven't bedded down yet. At the moment, it's quite skittish. You have a national leadership that is trying to appease the various factions within the party. And there is a very broad spectrum from right wing to left wing within the Communist Party of China. So there is that sense of a balance of power and various factions that they have to manage, that has to be managed. Though they are determined, and on the economic front, they've been very clear that they want to go to the next level. And the next level is to avoid the middle income trap, and it's to take themselves to a stage of where developed economies are at the moment. Finally, my final point then deals with about China and what we didn't talk about at all today because it's not officially part of Europe-Asia, though Asia-Pacific, I think the United States now classifies itself as an Asia-Pacific country as well. So when we're talking about revitalization, of course, you have your domestic changes within Japan, and Professor Foucault addressed those, and particularly the third arrow on growth, which is something the Europeans need as well to look at. And at the same time, you have these domestic reforms here, domestic reforms within China, and then you have also to look at the benefits that something that Neil Ferguson referred to in 2006 and again in 2010, and that's an axis for a revitalized world economy between the United States and America. Now this sounds mutually exclusive, but it's not. And it's also something that I think for the Europeans and the European Union is something that also allows them to rise with this tide. Because the European strategy within the EU is to sort of still wait for global growth to pull out some of its weaker southern partners. So it's a case of still hanging on for another few years. So then just again in conclusion, I think all of this is in a flux and in a balance. Within Europe and within Japan and within broader Asia, we can make these domestic changes and we can make the changes at the supranational level within the European Union. But outside of that, there are also two major factors that we, to some extent, have less control over, and that is the US and China. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So any comments or questions are welcome in the field of governance and policy making. Yes.
I have a comment, if I may. On Europe, I know that you ended with Asia, but in the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the issue of who let us where in European politics and economics. So I thought that this comment could show that finding European leadership would be even more complicated, because I am convinced that it was not Germany to lead us into the crisis, because Germany insisted on strong European Central Bank, keeping an eye on very low inflation, but actually it was sort of French decision to make the start of euro a little bit too hasty without checking the criteria, the Maastricht criteria profoundly.
No, but Germany, but on the functioning of the European Central Bank, when it suited the German economy to recover, interest rates were kept at a low level, at a level that did not suit economies like Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and the rates are kept at this level specifically because it was required for German domestic consumption. And the European Central Bank hasn't really changed much on its core functioning when you look at the lack of monetary stimulus. Okay, you some backstopping of debt and whatever, but again, it's always been made very clear by German political leaders that whatever the European Central Bank is going to do, it must conform with a political consensus within Germany or with the German constitution. And you see that you mentioned, I think Professor Mayers mentioned the legacy, which is very important when you look at the European banks, which is why a lot of them still have so many hidden problems, is that legacy issue of dealing with debt and whether the ESM will be able to be tapped to deal with that debt that's carried by various European banks. And Germany to date, along with other North European partners, including Finland, has been very clear that that's not going to be the case. So I think you're right. On paper, Germany will say, well, we want it to be run along these lines. But when it comes to practice, it's always going to be to suit the German economy.
I truly agree that it must suit the German economy because it's the strongest economy in Europe. But what I sort of tried to disagree with you is that the whole decision was the German one because they really insisted on the first setup of the Maastricht setup, but then it was changed because the consensus then was changed to the French side, and it was more or less French decision to not follow the Maastricht criteria that strictly, and we have the experience from the last decade of the European monetary system that it only worked when other countries, including Mitterrand in France, followed the German style of low inflationary politics. And that's what Germans knew, and that's what they wanted to make a basic setup of the European monetary integration, and it in fact didn't happen. So from that point of view, I do not see whether it's wrong or right. That's for sure that some countries must lead. But the European consensus led to something which is not German, but not French either. And similarly, in my eyes, it was not Delors who led Europe to the Single European Act, but it was European businesses who insisted on opening Europe back in late 1980s. So maybe even for today, let us do the businesses the part, because politicians and the political way of making the compromise seems not very suitable for these hard times.
Well, I think
okay,
the law...
thank you very much. Sorry. I think that European, especially currency unification is really a very kind of advanced topic for the Asian economies. And I think that we are still struggling with more basic issues, but probably, I think, but in that context, I think that the vacuum of leadership maybe can be somewhat filled in by international institutions like IMF or World Bank or WTO. But how, do you have any comments on this aspect? In this respect?
Being a European, I can see. I'll not go into that debate, but I mean, it's sort of illustrates the problem about getting a common position in Europe, because you can easily get into some kind of bickering who to blame, the German or the French, and what's going on. And I have no answer to that particular dispute at all. But I think I'd like to thank for the comments. Now we are in Europe. I actually think you're right, Brendan Smith, that Europe can model through. I think we are not out of the woods yet. There are lots of debt that needs to sort of be taken out of the system, and that's going to be painful, and it will take some years. But this is not the end of Europe at all. And but the direction it's going to take after some years, I'm not sure about that, really. And that's where also I think the question of the role of the US is going to be important because it matters a lot what's going on there. But I'd also like to say that to David Enwell's comment, I think it's very good that you bring in security issues, and now you talk about securitization of economic issues, but there's also the good old security issues. I mean, the American security umbrella, the agreements with Japan and Korea, and the tensions sometimes between the US and China. And I think it's one of the difficult issues really to understand is how the very special economic relationship, which is one of very deep interdependence with the Chinese accumulation of treasury bills, and then at the same time the element of security. I don't know what to call it really, but there are tensions from time to time, and the Chinese don't like the American military presence, and the Koreans and the Japanese prefer it to remain there, and so on. And how does that relate? And does that do the security issues? I mean, what you're talking about was that economic issues such as rare earth and things like that could spill over into security. But it could also be that the security situation overall has consequences for how the economic issues can be addressed. There's been, I mean, let's say the idea of developing a regional financial system or a regional development bank in East Asia. Can you do that if the Americans say they don't like that and you still want to keep the good? You get my point there. But, I think it's actually important also to take those issues into account, and that leads me to two observations really. One is the current security position of the U.S. I mean, the Syria issue was not. I mean, it's a very difficult situation what to do about Syria, but the way the Americans handled it created a lot of doubt about American resolve around the world, whether justified or not justified. But there's been this sort of, can we really trust the Americans? Do they know what they want to do? Do they really know when a red line is a red line, and etc.? So that's one area where we can say, my part of the world, we've been so used to the American presence, we can all rely on when push comes to shove, they were there, and etc. But there's been this kind of new debate because of the dysfunctionality of the American system. And there, just one more comment. I think when you talk so much about China also, I think that's very important, really. And I don't know if it's a chimera or chimeric you're talking about here, but
it's chimeric. It's a play on chimera.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, but I think it really is important. But what are the Americans going to do? Where are they going? Probably they'll get their house in order eventually. But I have a question. What will happen in China and elsewhere if the Americans decide to inflate their way out of their debt problems? I've just seen a recent statement by Bernanke that perhaps we should say that an inflation rate of 2-3% per year would not be that bad. That was a few days ago. What would happen if the Chinese see that their T-bills are losing value, and what would happen? I mean, it's a question. If the Americans, it's a soft solution to a big debt problem to avoid all the specific political conflict, because you can just distribute costs on everybody through inflation.
Okay, I think, would you like to respond to that question?
I can give a short response to that, I think. I mean, the first part of it is that I think Mr. Bernanke is a responsible central bank governor, and he's not suggesting that the Americans go to hyperinflation. The numbers he's talking about are 2 or 3%. That's the sort of level of inflation in Europe over the last decade until the crisis. He's quite right in talking about what sorts of solutions you need. If you're going to get the world growing faster, you've got to accept that it's going to increase the temperature a bit, and that seeing a degree of inflation is something we should expect. I mean, the same applies here, that you don't expect to be able to expand the Japanese economy rapidly without it having some inflationary consequences. What you don't want it to have is huge inflationary consequences. And the problem is the balance of how you get out of it. And I think that the biggest difficulty is that not everybody moves together, so that you start getting flows moving from one part of the world to another, as you get the process of development being somewhat uneven between them. And the difficulty is you only need small differences in growth rates for you then to have very big movements in both exchange rates and in capital flows. And that's very disturbing, particularly for small countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And